A pretext is a purpose or a motive alleged, or an appearance assumed, in order to cloak the real intention or state of affairs.
Initial access. OMI is trying to get into your network.
Listen, this is your manager, and I'm trying to send off an email. I got this document. Need you to confirm a few details, so go ahead and log in and tell me what you think. I need this now, so to make this convenient, here is the link. I'm a threat actor, fishing mark for email is urgent to distract you with it. So how fast you clicked it when you submitted the form with your password in it. You probably couldn't tell there was an actual difference in the URL. The domains look alike though, and to you it looks fine though, but mine had typos and make it look like yours. See, I was in the mood today to make your account a communal space, but then you activated your trap card, and I saw you had 2FA, but I just shrugged, I'ma shake it off. Got on kid gloves, I'ma take them off. Got your phone number, I'ma make a call. I'ma break this wall, it just makes me lol. I'm moving quick, I'm on a mission. Yeah, I heard your network is lit. I'm trying to get in. Yeah, I'm trying to get me a hit. When I go fishing. Yeah, you probably think it's legit. I got you clicking. Yeah. Hello. Hi. I'm calling you from the IT department. We have been under attack by some hackers, and we think that your account might be a target.
Oh no, how do I fix this?
No need to worry, I wrote up a ticket. You'll get a notification from your authenticator app, so please pass me them digits.
1 sec.
Okay.
Yeah. The code is 112345.
Thank you. You fell for the lie, so I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. Cutting it short like a crew cut. Probably think it won't happen to you, but it happened to Uber. They say you win some, you lose some. Boys got a smooth touch hacking you too, bruh. You know how I be creeping and I'm logging in your VP, and it probably looks anomalous. Some logs if you be keeping them, and probably unaware about the shares that have been peeping. And the reason I'll be seeking them, I'm looking for an easy win. You probably thought it was a magic trick, and you're mad you clicked. I'ma stack my chips and bet that a DA password is sitting in an admin script. I'm moving quick, I'm on a mission. Yeah, I heard your network is lit. I'm trying to get in. Yeah, I'm trying to get me a hit. When I go fishing. Yeah, you probably think it's legit. I got you clicking. I'm moving quick, I'm on a mission. Yeah, I heard your network is lit. I'm trying to get in. Yeah, I'm trying to get me a hit. When I go fishing. Yeah, you probably think it's legit. I got you clicking.
Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to today's session of the Azure Cloud Security Meetup group. So if you're wondering the music that's been playing, I put the link in the chat window. So that's Clicking by OMI. So nice music. What do you think about the music, Ibrahima? It's a nice one, right?
Yes, it's a nice one.
I like when he said, pass me the digit, right? Like, oh no, I fix it?
No, I think the best part is clicking.
Exactly, it's fun, right? Nice. Okay, so just some quick information before we get into today's session. If you're yet to join the community meetup group, what are you waiting for? So I'll put a link in the chat window. So make sure you go to the link, make sure you join the community. So that way you will be notified of upcoming events that we're putting together, of upcoming meetups. So we have Darwin joining us today. I'm really looking forward to the session. A lot of people have told me that they're looking forward to this session. So after Darwin's session, we'll have Kevin that will be joining us in beginning of April. We'll have Carl, who will co-wrote the book on Azure pen testing together and wrote the tool called Microburst. Carl will be joining us later that month. We have Joylene that will be joining us later also. And we have Joshua, who many of you will know, from the Azure, again, community. So he'll also be joining us. So we have amazing sessions. So make sure you join the community. That way, you will be notified when we've put out like an event. Is there anything else that I've missed before I bring up Ibrahima, before we bring up our speaker for today?
Yeah, feel free to destroy the like button.
Yeah, that's true. So please do click the like button for the video and also the share. Okay, so let's bring up our speaker for today. So hello, Darwin, how are you doing?
Doing pretty good. Can't complain. How are you, David and Ibrahima?
Doing good, doing good. Thanks very much. So thanks very much. Like
Fine,
to your point, like we should have met way much more earlier than this, because you started from like an Azure background, but now you're like fully multi-cloud, and you're even doing like some amazing stuff with your cybersecurity market pulse newsletter. Things relating to like what's going on with the market. So yeah, so like what's been going on with that? How's that going?
It's been going great. So the cybersecurity market pulse newsletter, I launched it just about a month ago. I usually keep a pulse on what's going on in the security industry in terms of like product releases, product feature enhancements. As a former consultant and practitioner myself, deploying and integrating some of these solutions in customers' environments, I get a feel for like what makes a product great versus what makes a product suck. And I just love to see the pace of innovation, and also where some of the pioneers and the cutting edge features and things that some of the pioneers in the space are doing, including like Palo Alto Networks, Wiz, Datadog as well, and ultimately like where the overall cloud security industry is heading. So that's some of the stuff that I cover there. I also cover companies coming out of stealth, VC funding, all of that stuff. So yeah, if you want to stay up to date with that, I do have a weekly newsletter. David, I think you posted the link in the chat. And yeah, as you mentioned, right, I've spent like 4 or 5 years in the Azure security space, and now in my current role at Datadog, I've been able to get my hands dirty with AWS and GCP. And it's just crazy how to see like some of the different intricacies and how the different cloud providers go about things. But at the end, it's very fun to tie it all together and help create like a robust product and detections for our customers. So fun stuff all around.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. I tell you, like what you've been doing for like, for just last year alone, it's just amazing to see. So we'll go ahead and we'll hand over to you to take us through the session. I'm really looking forward to this because, I've heard you shared a little bit about like resource graph in the past, and it was very informative, and I go a lot, and I'm really looking to take in what you have to share with us today. So to the audience, if you have any questions, as Darwin goes through the session, put your questions in the chat window and we'll read them out to Darwin at the end. So, but for now, I'll go ahead and hand over to you, and Ibrahim and myself will go backstage.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Yeah, so as David had mentioned, today I'll be going over the Azure Resource Graph service and how to leverage it for good and for evil. And I just provided some context into like why I've given this talk now for the third time. I find Azure Resource Graph so intriguing, and it's the fact that almost nobody talks about it, and it's such a powerful solution that it's...
Yes, apologies to interrupt. Okay. So that just took a while. So, but okay, it's showing now. So that wasn't showing initially. So we can see it now. Awesome. So I'll let you carry on.
Wonderful. Sorry about that. Cool. So yeah, it's a highly powerful solution that nobody talks about, and I think it should be brought onto front stage. Not only that, though, as a consultant and working in different customer, graph extremely helpful in finding me and allow me to like orient myself with different customer environments. So a little bit about myself: I'm a detection engineer for our CSPM product at Datadog. I am the author of the Cybersecurity Market Pulse newsletter. Prior to that, I was in Azure security, some time doing medical device security and some red teaming at Ford Motors. I currently hold the AZ500 Azure Security Engineer certification, also certified Kubernetes administrator, and the AZ900 Azure Fundamentals. And in terms of school, I have a master's degree in Homeland Security, and I've spent some time at Harvard Business School for a couple of programs. So that's me in a gist. Now let's jump into the fun stuff, right? So the agenda for today is I'm taking you from like a 10,000 foot overview of the overall Azure environment and how things work, and then diving deep on Azure Resource Graph. So we'll be covering Azure Resource Hierarchy and the Azure Resource Manager, which are very important to get those foundations and fundamentals down before we dive into Azure Resource Graph. And then after that, I'll be taking you through a couple of demos for how you can leverage Azure Resource Graph for blue teaming and for red teaming. And towards the end, we'll have Q&A. So without further ado, so the Azure resource hierarchy, what you see here on the right-hand side is the Azure Active Directory tenant. This is where you manage your users, your groups, is essentially your identity provider. And it's a separate platform actually from your Azure proper, where you manage your resources, access to your resources, and things of that nature. So on the left-hand side, it's much more complex. There's different tiers, and what you see at the top is the root management group, which is the highest management group. And if, let's say, for example, you deploy an Azure policy at the management group, that policy would cascade down to every underlying resource. And so the managing access and controlling that management group is extremely important. Some of what I've seen in customer environments is that they split out their management groups into production and non-production, and within there, they have different subscriptions. This creates a logical separation between the environments and allows, say, developers and engineers to go ahead and deploy and build and test out different theories in a safe environment, sandbox environment away from their production environment. And then within your subscriptions, that's essentially a logical container of all of your resources and resource groups. Now onto Resource Manager. I think that Azure Resource Manager is something that everybody who's jumping into Azure should absolutely understand and like pick apart and learn like the back of their hand, essentially, because it's the management and deployment service for Azure. As you can see in the diagram, whether you're interacting with Azure via the Azure Portal, PowerShell, the CLI, REST clients, any language like Python or Go, this is all going through the Azure Resource Manager API. And then from there, the Azure Resource Manager is what's actually executing and pushing through that activity to the resources. So whether it's creating, reading any metadata about a resource, or modifying a resource, or even deleting that resource, this is all carried out through the Azure Resource Manager service. It also enables Azure RBAC, resource locks, and resource tags. So Azure Resource Manager is extremely powerful. And now to the topic at hand, what is Azure Resource Graph, right? Azure Resource Graph, as Microsoft defines it, is a powerful management tool to query, explore, and analyze your cloud resources at scale. And I'll emphasize that at scale piece because it's part of what makes Azure Resource Graph so powerful. But the way that I would describe Azure Resource Graph is as the all-seeing eye for your entire Azure asset inventory. So it allows you to have, it doesn't provide you access into the data plane of these resources, but it provides you very detailed insights on the metadata of those resources, which is also extremely important and critical if it lands in the wrong hands. So here's an example. On the left-hand side, I just ran a Kusto Query Language query, KQL query, where I'm looking for all resources of the resource type key vaults. And on the right-hand side are like the fine-grained properties for this key vault. And what I can actually see is the permissions that the user principal that I'm logged in as, what permissions that principal has to this key vault. And so you can see that there's list, create, delete, wrap, and unwrap key, which are fairly risky permissions if they land in the wrong hands, but also just having visibility into what permissions a user principal has across different resources is extremely important and powerful if an attacker is able to get their hands on Azure Resource Graph within an environment. So this is crucial here. Another cool thing about Azure Resource Graph actually is that that at scale piece that I emphasized previously is that here you can see the scope. You could query across all subscriptions within the tenant, and it's extremely efficient, right? So it queried across 96,000 resources in less than a second. That is pretty mind-blowing. Now, most of the juice and most of the important details and all of that stuff is actually inside of this See Details panel here. But here's some of the metadata that it provides. It provides like the name of the resource, the resource type, location, and which resource group it belongs to, resource tags, etc. And so, cool. I've shown you like a couple of queries. I've broken down some of the fundamentals into how Azure Resource Hierarchy, Resource Manager and how Azure, like some of the things that Azure Resource Graph does. Now tying it all together, why should you care? So Azure Resource Graph actually powers the Azure Portal search bar. So if you're in an Azure environment or you're working for an Azure shop, you're probably interacting with Azure Resource Graph every day, and you don't even know it. Also, Azure Resource Graph only requires the Azure RBAC reader role to be able to query it and leverage the solution. So those are fairly low-level permissions. It also maintains resource change history over the past 14 days. So it's pretty good for like change management, just having visibility over what activity is going on within your environment. It's also highly compatible. So it's compatible with Go, Python, .NET, PowerShell, Java, etc. So you can leverage it for many different custom solutions and get very creative with Azure Resource Graph. Most importantly now, these next 3-4 points are kind of like what is most mind-blowing to me, right? Azure Resource Graph is compatible with all GA, generally available Azure Resource APIs. So rather than, if you want to query information about all of the key vaults in your environment, rather than going to and querying the Key Vault API endpoint, you could query the Azure Resource Graph API endpoint and receive that same information. But now let's say you wanted to query 5 different resource types. You would have to hit each endpoint with a query. So you're essentially substituting 5 queries with 1 query in Azure Resource Graph. Also, you can automate queries via Azure Logic Apps. So there's with the Logic Apps Designer, which I'll show. I have it in the demo video a little later. Most importantly, though, I think is that Azure Resource Graph allows for cross-subscription querying. So if you're managing an estate of, let's say, 30 Azure subscriptions, rather than having to go and query via Azure CLI or PowerShell subscription by subscription, which is fairly tedious, you could just query at the all subscription, at the scope of all subscriptions, and have visibility into all of the resources within the entire tenant. You could also select, like 14 out of 30 of those subscriptions that you really care about. So it allows you that fine-grained management control as well. And something that should really be eye-opening is that Azure Resource Graph also allows for cross-tenant querying if the organization which you're logged into leverages Azure Lighthouse. So let's think of this scenario where you have a managed service provider that manages the SOC for multiple organizations, and those SOCs run on Microsoft Sentinel. If an attacker lands on that parent organization or that managed service provider organization, they would be able to query across all of the tenants, all of those customer environments using Azure Resource Graph. And I have links on this later, like in the final slides in the appendix, and I'll share this out with David a little later, so you can blast it out to you guys. But that was fairly alarming to me. And now I have a meme here of Azure Resource Graph showing its superiority over Azure CLI and PowerShell, just because it's so much more efficient and powerful. So now, how does Azure Resource Graph work? Whenever a resource is created, modified, or deleted, the Azure Resource Manager service notifies Resource Graph, and Resource Graph records that change to its database. And so Azure Resource Graph is able to maintain the current state of all of the resources in the environment, leveraging this, but also they run periodic recurring scans across the entire environment, just in case they missed anything that that was outside of Azure Resource Manager's purview. And then from there, we can query using our language of preference, whether it's Go, KQL, Python. We can query insights about all of the resources in our environment. So that's how it works on the back end. And now let's jump into, let's make this more practical, right? Let's jump into an actual scenario. So let's say your company has just acquired or is considering acquiring a small startup. The startup is a team of 4. You have maybe like 1 product person, 2 engineers, and like the CEO or whatever the case may be. They have a fairly like cutting edge solution, but they don't have a security team. And now your job is to orient yourself with the Azure tenant and to get an asset inventory of all of the Azure resources in the environment, but also identify resources that pose immediate security risk to the organization. And so anything that could cause reputational damage to your organization, that's what they're trying to avoid there. And we see this a lot in merger and acquisition processes, where you'll have the organization that is buying out another go and have security assessments performed on that environment. And so this is one case where Azure Resource Graph can come in handy. Here's another meme. As you can tell, I love memes, but you have a company acquiring a small startup that has no security team, and now that company is now responsible for securing the environment. Interesting stuff out there. So now let's jump into our demo. Just rewind this. Cool. And so if you want to access Azure Resource Graph, you can do it through the portal. Just type in Resource Graph in the search bar. Again, on the left-hand side, you can see the scope, which you can define for you to query at management group level, subscription group. You could even query at the resource group level. It just has to be hard-coded in the query. You can see all of the different resource types you have access to. So you have like AI, ML, big data, your containers, Kubernetes clusters, and core services like key vaults and storage. And now on the right-hand side, you have your different tables. So another cool thing about Azure Resource Graph is that you could actually query the Azure policy results for the environment and see which resources are failing what Azure policies, which resources are non-compliant and currently misconfigured, and things of that nature. But today we'll actually be focusing just on resources, right? And so I click on the resource table. Real quick here, another cool thing about Azure Resource Graph and Microsoft is that they actually left behind various pre-canned queries so that you could get started with this today. So if you want to see, for example, how many key vault resources you have in your environment, how many virtual machines, any public IP addresses you have, any machines with public IP addresses that you have in your environment, things of that nature. So within, you can see here, less than half a second, I was able to dump all of the resources in my environment. And it did so kind of like not the prettiest way, right? Because here we have like the resource ID, which is the overall path for that resource. You have the name of the resource type. All of this is kind of like, it's an eyesore to look at. But if you click on formatted results, it'll clean that up for you, and you can actually click on the resource, and it'll bring you right to that resource. So this is a much more cleaned up version. You see the different resource types. I have a super insecure cluster, AKS cluster that we'll dig into now. And so as you can see here, the resource type, container service managed cluster. And if we dig into the properties, you can see the network profile, what network plugin it's using. You can see things like the pod CIDR, DNS service IP, a bunch of stuff about the network profile. And now there's stuff about the security profile of the cluster as well. So you could see resource tags, right? Here you could see it's the environment it's in is in production, data type it's managing and interacting with its GDPR. Things about the performance and details about just the cluster, right? So max pods, max host, things of that nature. You can see whether Azure Key Vault is configured and integrated with the cluster, Azure policy, any application routing, and here you can see it's all false. Whether RBAC is enabled within the cluster, private cluster is not enabled. And so 109 lines of insights for this one cluster, right? And now this is a container registry, which I purposefully configured to be insecure. And if you look here in line number 3 to 5, public network access is enabled and the encryption on the registry is disabled. You have the login server. You have whether or not admin user is enabled, I think it was, and just a bunch of details, right, about this container registry. So, you know, as a blue teamer, these are things that you have to hunker down on and secure. You may want to look at the activity logs for these resources to see if they've already been compromised, any fishy activity going on there. But now let's dive in a couple layers deeper, right? I'm looking here for storage
Just to
accounts
interrupt,
where
Darwin, sorry about that. So I'm not
No
sure if
worries.
it's possible to increase the resolution of the video.
Let's see. I put it on 1080 HD now rather than auto.
I think that would be better. Yeah. Thanks very much.
No worries. Yeah. So here I'm looking for storage accounts that have blob public access enabled. And here, as you can see, the query returned 2 results. There are 2 storage accounts that have blob public access enabled. This is like all of the metadata for these resources. Just digging deeper to confirm that blob public access is enabled, and it is. And so what, right? These storage accounts, are they in non-production environments? Are they hosting sensitive data, things of that nature? This is something else that you can find out using Azure Resource Graph. So here I add a couple of lines of KQL where I'm looking at the resource tags for environment and data type, and I'm looking for production environment, GDPR data type, and also for storage accounts residing in regions outside of Europe, because if that storage account is publicly accessible, it's residing outside of Europe, and it's storing GDPR data, then that's a big financial and regulatory risk that we'll be taking on as the company acquiring the startup. And so here you can see that there's one actual result that has returned a resource which those such conditions that I just mentioned. And it's something that definitely should raise a lot of concerns and questions on how to remediate for the company acquiring the startup. So as I had mentioned previously, you could actually automate some of these queries with logic apps. And so you could run it like on a 12-hour, or however often you want, whatever interval you'd like. And then you just paste the query in there. I have links into documentation onto how to actually do this. But you could also create a workflow that if there are results for this query, just trigger off an alert within Sentinel, shoot off a message to Slack and create a Jira ticket or whatever workflow you would like. Logic Apps Designer and Logic App Solution overall is just a fairly flexible solution. So now that we know how this can be leveraged for a blue team scenario, let's take a look at like a real world example of how Azure Resource Graph has actually been leveraged before. And so I want to say last May or June, Palo Alto Networks research, I think it's Unit 42, if I remember correctly, they had discovered a critical vulnerability in Azure Service Fabric Cluster solution that impacted Linux images, but did not impact Windows nodes, right? And so here's Christophe. He's a security researcher and architect from France. He actually posted this very helpful resource graph query that allowed folks to see whether or not they had any vulnerable Service Fabric, any vulnerable Linux images on Service Fabric clusters, so that they could go ahead and remediate or patch, right? And so this kind of shows the prowess of Azure Resource Graph for proactive vulnerability management, which I thought was pretty cool seeing this in the wild. Now, for my red teamers, let's take a look at how Azure Resource Graph can be leveraged for evil. So in this scenario, you've been hired to execute a red team exercise on a hospital's Azure environment. You've gained initial access to an Azure account via a phishing campaign. The account has reader role access across the entire tenant. What can you do next to escalate your privileges and kind of show the security team that hired you how bad things can really get? So onto our red team demo. Let me increase the resolution here. Awesome. Cool. So another cool thing about Azure Resource Graph is that you could actually save your queries for your teammates to use and things of that nature. So here I have a query that is looking for virtual machines that have public IP addresses, and I'm looking for the operating system image information for that virtual machine. So since network interface, public IP addresses, and virtual machines are 3 different resources in Azure, I kind of have it broken out into 3 different queries joined by the join operator. And here I have 2 virtual machines that have public IP addresses. I could see their image version, operating system, and here I have an Active Directory domain controller under the Evil Corp subscription. And so I will pivot over and now just dump all of the network security group rules in this environment. This is a fairly long query, but it's just cleaning up the output. And I have these queries in my GitHub, and I'll share that with you guys as well. But here, as you can see, there are 2 non-default network security group rules. And this one allows RDP traffic over RDP traffic from any source, so from any IP address, public internet, and it belongs within the same subscription and VNet of that domain controller that we just saw. And so if you're able to get all of this metadata about like the resources within the environment, and also you can correlate between if you're sophisticated, or if you even have like a fair amount of knowledge and a grasp of how Azure security works, you can come up with some pretty nefarious and creative use cases on how you can leverage Azure Resource Graph in your red team exercises. This screenshot is also fairly compelling here, right? So this is, I'm just querying like a random virtual machine here, and I'm looking for the admin username. So from here in the OS profile, you can see the computer name, but also the admin username. So the only piece of the equation that is missing for you to RDP into a machine is the password, because you already know that it's publicly exposed over the network security group rule, has a public IP address, and now you know the admin username. So that's fairly scary. You can also see the Windows configuration, so whether automatic updates are enabled, things of that nature. So if you're an attacker and you're squatting on an environment and the automatic updates flag is not enabled, but a new a 0-day comes out for this operating system image and version, then you know you could query across the environment to see which resources have not been patched. You can use those as your target as well. And so to conclude, some key takeaways. Azure Resource Graph is pretty much a double-edged sword hidden in plain sight, because you can use it for a lot of blue team exercises. It's fairly robust, but also attackers can use it if they land in your environment. And so it's a double-edged sword. It's compatible with numerous languages and Azure services, and it has endless use cases. So you could use it for asset inventory, attack surface management. So you can see with the public IP addresses and things of that nature, vulnerability management, CMDB, so change management, resource change history. You could also leverage it as an ad hoc CSPM solution, right? You could see which resources are misconfigured for a certain condition. You could also use it for attack path research and limitless reconnaissance as an attacker. Now, if you'd want to take a look at the actual queries that I used in the demos, this is the QR code for that on the top right-hand side. And then I also have a ton of workshop at DEF CON Cloud Security Village for Kusto Query Language, where I went through just teaching like the fundamentals of Kusto Query Language and how to use it with Azure Resource Graph and Microsoft Sentinel. And that repository and that slide deck is here. And as I had mentioned, here are like all of the resources, some stuff on the Azure Lighthouse, things of that nature, and how other Azure Recon tools stack up in the open source field. And then like lastly, something that I didn't list here because I was working through this with Microsoft research is that very alarming and came as a surprise to me is that none of the queries or activity that is performed within Azure Resource Graph Explorer or any of the Azure Resource Graph services or endpoints, none of that is logged. And the reason why this activity is not logged is because it's all only read operations. All that the Azure Resource Graph is doing, you're shooting off a query to go retrieve certain metadata, and the Resource Graph service is just reading the metadata from the resource. So it's not actually interacting with the resource or doing anything that would trigger a certain activity, right? And so if it did log read activity, it would be potentially noisy and things of that nature. And so this provides attackers with a sweet spot of a solution that allows you to perform limitless reconnaissance without being detected. And I thought that was a vulnerability worth reporting, but it was mentioned that this is by design, and it was later explained to me why, which makes sense, right? But from a defender perspective, I think Azure Resource Graph is a service to keep an eye on, and would have loved to see some logs for this. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll hand it off to you, David. I'm not sure we have questions.
Awesome. Thanks very, very much for that. That was awesome, Darwin. Thanks very much for that amazing presentation. Okay, yeah, I think I got Ibrahim back. So let's go back. So yeah, there are some questions in the chat window. So Ibrahim, is there anyone that you can see? You can see that. Yeah. So
this one. Yeah, do companies that provide a CSPM offering leverage Azure Resource Graph to identify indicator of configuration?
So I would say yes. I see it's hard to like know the internals of every how every organization builds out their CSPM and what APIs they rely on. But in order to provide like a full asset inventory of an Azure environment, Azure Resource Graph is the way to go. And I also believe that Microsoft leverages Azure Resource Graph themselves under the hood for some of their newer solutions like Cloud Security Graph Explorer and things of that nature. So I can't answer the question unequivocally, but my assumption is yes, that organizations are using Azure Resource Graph under the hood.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So there's another question that I think came in. So let me go scroll up to, okay. So the question is, how does Azure Resource Graph integrate with other Azure monitoring and management tools such as Azure Monitor and Azure Log Analytics?
I haven't explored that. So I can't provide like a clear answer, but that's a good thing for me to research next. So that's a very great question.
Yeah, nice, awesome. Thanks very much for that. So I do have a question because one of the amazing things, and I think I heard you say it also like in the previous talk where you gave this and you talked about this, is that this is not logged. Does that mean that we're going to be seeing like Microsoft on the Datadog or audit log wall of shame very soon? And Microsoft going to be showing up there. So for those that may not know, so Datadog, where Darwin currently works, so they publish something called like the audit log wall of shame, where it's sort of like companies that are not doing properly when it comes to logging. So yeah, is Microsoft going to show up on it once in a while? No, I'm just putting you on the spot here. Sorry.
That's a great question. And since I haven't, it's been a while since I touched Azure Resource Graph and like went through like that when I submitted it as a bug. It's been like maybe like 6-7 months since like that conversation that this is built like that by design. I didn't make the correlation to bring this up on whether it should be included in the wall of shame. But now that I think about it, I truly believe that it does, because it creates a gray zone for customers, right? Where an attacker could literally be performing recon for months on end on the environment and go undetected. And so I think that is worthy of being on the wall of shame. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's very interesting. Awesome. Okay. So Ibrahim, do you have any questions before we round up the session? Any other questions from you, Ibrahim, before we round up the session?
I think there is no more question.
Yeah.
For me, it's very clear and very insightful. Thank you a lot, Darwin.
Yeah, completely agree. So that was really, really useful. So thanks very much, Darwin. So again, we'll look forward to welcoming you back, whenever you're back doing presentations at the Azure Cloud Security Meetup group. But for now, thanks very much. And we'll see you all next time. Have a lovely rest of the day. Thanks very much, Darwin. Thanks very much, Ibrahim. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye for now.
Cheers.